3 years. Ethan Cole's voice was low, controlled, but something in it finally cracked. 3 years, and I never touched my own wife, until tonight. The words hung in the air like a confession he could no longer contain, and across from him, Lily Harper stood frozen, her fingers tightening around the edge of the marble kitchen counter, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded in a world that had never quite felt like hers. The penthouse around them stretched wide and silent, glass walls revealing the glittering Manhattan skyline. A world of power and wealth that had always belonged to him. Never to her. Not really. Not even after the ring. Not even after the vows. Not even after 3 long years of being Mrs. Cole in name. But nothing more. She had learned the rhythm of this life the hard way. Learned how to move quietly through hallways that echoed with absence. Learned which lights he preferred dimmed, which meals he never finished, which days he wouldn't come home at all. And most of all, she had learned the invisible line he had drawn around himself. A line she was never meant to cross, the night they got married. Replayed in her mind with cruel clarity. The contract laid out in precise legal language. The terms colder than the polished steel of his office desk. No emotional involvement. No interference in each other's personal lives. And one rule that had lingered heavier than the rest. Unspoken but understood. This marriage would never be real. Back then, she had nodded, her voice steady even as her chest tightened. Because she needed this. Because survival sometimes looked like compromise. And Ethan Cole had needed something too. A respectable wife, a stable image, a solution to a problem he would never fully explain. So they signed. And just like that, she became his wife, moving into a space that felt more like a museum than a home, filled with expensive furniture no one truly lived in, rooms that stayed untouched, and a master bedroom she never once stepped into. Instead, her world became the guest suite down the hall, smaller, quieter, hers only in the most temporary sense, like everything else in this arrangement. At first, she told herself it was fine, that distance was easier, that expectations were dangerous. But time has a way of revealing the truth in the quietest moments, in the way her eyes would linger on him just a second too long when he adjusted his cufflinks, in the way her heart would betray her when he said her name in that calm, measured tone, in the way she noticed everything about him even when she pretended not to care. And then there were the nights, the ones where the city outside never seemed to sleep. And neither did she, lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what it would feel like to be more than just a name on his documents, more than just a presence in his house, wondering what it would be like if he ever looked at her not as an obligation, but as something real. But Ethan Cole never crossed that line, not once, not even by accident. Even in the rare moments when they stood too close, when their hands almost brushed, when the air between them shifted into something heavier, he would step back, always step back, as if control mattered more than anything else, as if whatever he was holding in was stronger than whatever might happen if he let go. And Lily learned to step back too, learned to match his distance with her own dignity. Because if he had built walls, she refused to beg for a door. Yet tonight felt different. Something subtle but undeniable had shifted. The air was thicker, charged with something neither of them had named. And as Ethan took a slow step closer, his eyes no longer distant but locked onto hers with a focus that made her breath catch, she realized with a quiet, rising certainty that whatever rules had kept them apart for 3 years were about to break. And for the first time since the day she signed that contract, she didn't know if she should be afraid or if she had been waiting for this all along. The silence between them did not break immediately. It stretched, tight and fragile, as if even the smallest word could shatter something neither of them fully understood yet. And Lily felt it in the way her heartbeat refused to slow down, in the way Ethan's presence suddenly felt too close, too real, like the invisible distance he had maintained for 3 years had quietly disappeared without her noticing. She swallowed, forcing herself to hold his gaze even as her mind raced backward, trying to make sense of what had changed, because men like Ethan Cole did not act on impulse. They calculated, they controlled, they decided long before they ever moved, which meant this moment was not sudden for him. It was chosen, and that realization unsettled her more than anything else. "You should not do this," she said softly, her voice steady but laced with something deeper, not fear, not exactly, but a boundary she had spent years building just to protect herself. We agreed on the terms, and for a second, just a second, she thought he would step back again like he always did, that he would restore the careful distance that defined them. But he did not move, not this time. His expression shifting in a way she had never seen before, less guarded, less controlled, as if something long buried had finally reached the surface. That was before, he replied, his tone quieter now, but heavier, and Lily felt the weight of those words settle into her chest because before meant everything that came prior, every silent dinner, every avoided glance, every night spent alone in separate rooms, every moment she had convinced herself not to feel anything for him. She let out a slow breath, shaking her head just slightly, because it was not that simple. It could never be that simple. 3 years is not just before. Ethan, she said, and this time there was no softness left, only truth. 3 years is a decision you made over and over again. And that landed. She could see it in the brief flicker in his eyes, the acknowledgement he did not try to deny. The city lights behind him reflected faintly in the glass, casting sharp lines across his face. And for the first time, she noticed something she had missed all this time. Not coldness, not indifference, but restraint, the kind that came from holding something back for too long. Do you think I did not notice? She continued, her voice lower now, steadier. Every time you almost said something, every time you almost reached out, every time you chose not to, her fingers tightened slightly against the counter, grounding herself. You think I did not feel that? Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair in a rare break from his usual composure. And when he looked at her again, there was no distance left in his eyes, only something raw and unfiltered that made her chest tighten in a completely different way. I noticed everything, he said, and there was no hesitation this time, no calculation, just honesty. That was the problem, and Lily blinked, caught off guard by the admission, because that was not what she expected, not from him, not from the man who had built his entire life on control. Then why? She asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it, because if he had seen her, if he had noticed, then why had he stayed so far away? Why had he let 3 years pass like they were nothing? Why had he allowed her to stand beside him as his wife, but never truly be part of his world? Ethan took another step closer, not abrupt, not forceful, but deliberate, closing the space between them in a way that made her breath hitch despite herself. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, quieter, but filled with a weight that had clearly been there all along. Because the moment I stopped keeping my distance, he said, his gaze unwavering now, I would not know how to stop wanting more. And that was it. That was the truth he had hidden for 3 years, not indifference, not lack of feeling, but something far more dangerous, something he had been trying to control all along, and standing there in the quiet of that penthouse, with the city stretching endlessly behind them. Lily realized that whatever had been holding them apart was not absence, it was fear, and now that fear was gone. The air between them shifted in a way Lily could not ignore anymore, not after everything he had just said, not after the quiet confession that reframed 3 years of distance into something entirely different. And for a moment she simply stood there, searching his face as if she might find a reason to doubt him, something familiar, something cold, something safe. But there was none of that left, only a man who looked like he had finally stopped holding himself back. And that made her chest tighten in a way that was both unsettling and impossible to dismiss. She let out a small breath, her gaze dropping for just a second before lifting again. Because if this was happening, if he was finally stepping past the boundaries he had built, then she needed to understand everything, not just the part he was willing to show now, but the part he had hidden all along. So you chose silence instead, she said, her voice quieter now, but no less steady. You chose to pretend none of it existed. And Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in defense but in acknowledgement, because there was no denying it. He had made that choice, over and over again, until it became the only way he knew how to keep control. I chose what I thought was safer, he replied. And there was a weight to that word, safer, as if it carried more meaning than it should have, as if it was not just about distance, but about something deeper, something he had never said out loud before. Lily frowned slightly, taking that in, because safety had never been part of her experience in this marriage, not in the way he meant it, not in the quiet loneliness, not in the constant reminder that she existed beside him but never with him. And she shook her head just slightly. Safe for who? She asked, and that question lingered, sharp and unavoidable, because it cut through everything else and went straight to the truth he had been avoiding. Ethan did not answer immediately, and in that pause, Lily felt something shift again, something heavier, as if the silence itself was finally demanding honesty. And when he spoke, it was slower, more deliberate than before. Not for you, he admitted. And there it was, the first real fracture in the version of him she had known. The first time he acknowledged what his choices had actually cost her. She swallowed, her fingers loosening slightly from the counter as she absorbed that, because hearing it said out loud made it real in a way she had not allowed herself to fully confront before. Then why marry me at all? She asked. And this time the question was not soft, it was direct, because this was the part she had never truly understood, the part that had haunted her in the quiet moments when everything else fell away. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting for a brief second, as if even now, this part was harder to say than anything else. But when he looked back at her, there was no hesitation left, only the truth he had kept buried from the very beginning. Because I needed someone I could trust, he said, and Lily blinked, caught off guard again, because that was not the answer she expected. Not from him, not from a man who had access to anything and anyone he wanted. And you trusted me? She asked, almost incredulous, because from her perspective, trust had never been part of the equation, not when he kept her at a distance, not when he never let her in. Ethan nodded once, a small, certain motion that carried more weight than anything else he had said. From the moment you signed that contract without asking for more, he said, his voice quieter now. From the moment you chose dignity over advantage. And something in her expression shifted at that, something she could not quite hide, because she had never thought he noticed that, never thought he saw anything beyond the surface of their arrangement. I saw you, he continued, stepping just slightly closer again, not enough to overwhelm, but enough to close the space even further. And that is exactly why I kept my distance. And Lily's breath caught at that, because now it made a different kind of sense, not the kind that erased the hurt, but the kind that explained it, the kind that turned 3 years of silence into something more complicated, something more dangerous than she had ever allowed herself to consider. And standing there with him now, with nothing left unspoken, she realized that the line between them had not just been crossed, it had been erased entirely. The realization did not bring relief, not immediately, because understanding something did not erase what it had cost. And Lily felt that truth settle quietly, but firmly in her chest, as she looked at Ethan standing just a few feet away, closer than he had ever allowed himself to be before, and yet somehow it still felt like there was a distance that had not fully disappeared. Not yet, not until everything was said, everything was faced. She let out a slow breath, her eyes steady on his, because if he had truly seen her all this time, if he had truly chosen distance because of what he felt, then there was something he still had not answered, something that mattered more than anything else now. You trusted me, she repeated softly, as if testing the weight of his words. But you never gave me the chance to trust you. And that landed differently, sharper, because it was not just about the past anymore. It was about what had been missing from the beginning. Ethan's expression shifted again, more subtle this time, but enough for her to see that he understood exactly what she meant, because trust was not one-sided, and whatever he had believed he was protecting, he had done it alone, without her, without ever asking if she would have chosen differently. You made that decision for both of us, she continued, her voice calm but unwavering. You decided what this marriage would be, what it would never be, and you never once asked me if I agreed. And for the first time that night, there was no softness left in her tone, only clarity, because this was the truth she had carried quietly for years, the part she had never spoken out loud because there had never been a moment like this before, a moment where he was actually listening. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for just a second before returning to hers. And in that brief hesitation, Lily saw something she had never seen in him before, not control, not certainty, but something closer to regret, something that did not come easily to a man like him. You are right, he said, and the simplicity of it caught her off guard, because she had expected resistance, explanation, something to justify it. But instead he gave her the one thing she had never received from him before, acknowledgement without defense, and it shifted something inside her in a way she could not ignore. The city outside remained unchanged, lights stretching endlessly into the distance. But inside that penthouse, everything felt different now, quieter, heavier, as if the space itself was holding on to every word they had exchanged. Lily straightened slightly, her shoulders lifting not in defiance but in resolve, because if this moment was real, if this shift between them was not just temporary, then she needed to be just as honest as he was finally trying to be. "Do you know what it feels like?" she asked, her voice softer now, but more vulnerable than before. "To live with someone who sees you, but chooses not to reach for you." And that question lingered, not as an accusation, but as something deeper, something that carried the weight of every quiet night, every unspoken thought, every moment she had stood just a step away from him and wondered if he would ever close the distance. Ethan did not answer right away, and this time, the silence between them felt different, not empty, but full, as if it was forcing him to truly hear her, not just the words but everything behind them. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, stripped of anything unnecessary. "I thought distance would protect us," he said, and there was no certainty left in that belief anymore, only the recognition of what it had actually done. Lily shook her head slightly, her lips pressing together before she spoke again. "It did not protect anything," she said quietly. "It just made everything harder." And for a moment, neither of them moved, the space between them holding that truth like something fragile, something that could not be taken back once it was spoken. Then Ethan took another step forward, slower this time, more careful, as if he understood that this was not about closing the distance quickly, but about earning the right to stand there at all. And when he stopped, just within reach, but not crossing that final line yet, his voice was steady, but no longer distant. "Then let me do it differently," he said, not as a command, not as control, but as a choice. And for the first time since this began, Lily felt the weight of that shift, because this was no longer about a contract, no longer about rules. It was about whether she would allow something real to begin where something controlled had existed for far too long. For a moment, Lily did not answer, and that silence was not empty. It was full of everything she had held back for 3 years, every quiet compromise, every moment she chose dignity over disappointment, every time she told herself that this was enough because it had to be. And now, standing in front of Ethan as he offered something different, something real, she realized that accepting it would mean risking everything she had carefully protected inside herself. Her fingers loosened from the edge of the counter, her posture softening, just slightly as she looked at him, really looked at him, not as the distant man she had learned to live beside, but as the man who was finally choosing to stand in front of her without the shield of control, and that alone was enough to make her hesitate. Because change, even the kind you want, is never easy when it comes this late. "Different is not something you decide in a moment," she said quietly, her voice steady but thoughtful, as if she was measuring every word before letting it exist. "Between them, it is something you prove." And Ethan nodded once, not immediately, but with the kind of understanding that did not need explanation, because for the first time, he was not trying to lead the situation, he was following it, allowing her to set the pace in a way he never had before. "Then I will prove it," he replied, and there was no force in his voice, no expectation, just a statement that felt grounded in something deeper than intention, something that suggested he knew this would not be quick, would not be simple, and Lily felt that too. The weight of what he was asking without saying it directly, the shift from a controlled arrangement to something uncertain, something that required trust on both sides, not just his version of it, but hers as well. She took a small step back, not out of fear, but to create space, to think, to breathe, because proximity had always meant something different in this marriage, and now it carried a new kind of significance she was not ready to ignore. Her gaze drifted briefly to his left hand, to the ring that had always been there, but had never truly meant what it was supposed to, a symbol without substance, a promise without action, and for a moment, she wondered if that was about to change, or if this was just another moment that would fade once reality settled back in. "And if I do not believe you yet?" she asked, her eyes returning to his, not challenging, but honest, because belief was not something she could simply choose. Not after everything that had come before. Ethan did not hesitate this time, did not retreat into silence or distance. Instead, he met her question with the same steadiness she had shown him. "Then I will keep showing you until you do," he said, and there was something in that answer that felt different from anything he had ever offered before. Not a solution, not a shortcut, but a process, something that would take time, something that required consistency, and Lily felt that settle into her chest in a way that was both unfamiliar and quietly grounding. The city lights outside flickered softly against the glass, the reflection of them casting faint patterns across the floor, and for a moment, everything felt still again, but not in the same way as before. This stillness carried possibility, not distance, and Lily realized that this was the first time since their marriage began that she was not standing in a fixed position, not confined by the rules they had agreed to, but standing at a crossroads where something real could actually begin. She inhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction as she made a decision. Not a final one, not a complete surrender, but a step. Small but significant. "Then start now," she said, her voice calm but clear, and in that moment, it was not just a response. It was an opening, a quiet permission for something new to take shape. And as Ethan held her gaze, not moving too quickly, not breaking the fragile balance between them, it became clear that whatever came next would not be defined by what they had been, but by what they were willing to become. The words lingered between them, quiet but undeniable, and for the first time since the night began, Ethan did not move forward, did not close the final space that remained between them, because this was no longer about impulse or control. It was about restraint of a different kind, the kind that respected what she had just given him. A chance, not an answer, not a guarantee, but something far more valuable. And he understood that. Lily watched him carefully, searching for the familiar signs she had grown used to over the years, the calculated step, the quiet withdrawal, the return to distance, but none of that came. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was, close enough to matter, far enough to respect the boundary she had just redefined, and that alone shifted something inside her in a way she did not expect. "Then we start with something simple," he said after a moment, his voice steady, no longer carrying the weight of urgency, but something calmer, more grounded, and Lily felt her breath slow slightly at that, because simple was not a word she had ever associated with anything between them, not in 3 years of careful distance and unspoken tension. She tilted her head just slightly, a faint crease forming between her brows as she studied him, waiting, not with impatience, but with cautious curiosity, because whatever came next would matter more than anything he had said so far. Ethan's gaze softened just a fraction, not losing its intensity, but shifting into something quieter, something that did not demand but offered. "Tomorrow," he said, "we have dinner together." And for a second, Lily almost smiled, not because the idea was extraordinary, but because it was so ordinary, so unexpectedly normal that it caught her off guard. Dinner, something most couples did without thinking, something they had never truly done as husband and wife. "We have had dinner before," she pointed out gently, her voice carrying a hint of familiarity now, not cold, not distant, but real, because she remembered those meals, the long table, the quiet, the polite exchanges that never crossed into anything meaningful. Ethan shook his head slightly, a small but certain motion. "No," he said, "we have eaten at the same table. That is not the same thing." And that distinction landed more deeply than she expected, because he was right. They had shared space, not connection, routine, not intention, and Lily felt something inside her shift again, something small but significant. "So what makes this different?" she asked, her tone softer now, less guarded, as if part of her was already leaning into the possibility even while the rest of her remained careful. Ethan held her gaze, not looking away, not deflecting. "I do," he answered simply, and there was no arrogance in it, no assumption, just a quiet certainty that this time, he would show up in a way he never had before. The simplicity of it caught her off guard again, because there were no grand gestures, no dramatic promises, just something steady, something real, and Lily realized that maybe that was what made it different, not the action itself, but the intention behind it. She nodded slowly, not fully committing, but not pulling away either, and that was enough for now. Enough to move forward without rushing into something neither of them could take back. The city outside continued its endless motion, lights flickering, cars moving, life carrying on as it always did, but inside that penthouse, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, something quiet but undeniable. And as Lily turned slightly, stepping away from the counter not to leave, but simply to move, to breathe, to exist in this new space they were creating together, she realized that for the first time since their marriage began, she was not just staying, she was choosing to see what could happen next, and Ethan, watching her with a steadiness that no longer felt distant, understood that this was only the beginning, not of something perfect, but of something real. The next evening arrived with a quiet kind of anticipation that Lily was not used to feeling in this home. And as she stood in front of the mirror in her room, adjusting the sleeve of a simple cream-colored dress she had not worn in months, she realized how unfamiliar it felt to prepare for something that was not an obligation, but a possibility. For 3 years, evenings had followed a pattern she could predict without thinking. Meals eaten in silence or separately, conversations limited to what was necessary, her presence acknowledged but never truly engaged. And now, as she glanced at her reflection one more time, she found herself wondering why something as ordinary as dinner felt like stepping into something entirely new. Downstairs, the dining area looked the same as it always had, the long table polished, the soft lighting casting warm shadows across the room. But there was one difference that immediately caught her attention. The table was not set for two at opposite ends as it had been countless times before. Instead, 2 plates were placed side by side at the center, close enough to suggest something intentional, something that did not rely on distance to maintain order. Lily paused for just a second at the edge of the room, taking it in, and for reasons she could not fully explain, that small detail unsettled her more than anything else, because it was not grand, it was not dramatic, but it was deliberate, and that meant he had thought about it. "You are early." Ethan's voice came from behind her, calm, steady, and when she turned, she found him standing a few steps away, dressed simply. Compared to his usual sharp business attire, no jacket, no tie, just a dark shirt with the sleeves slightly rolled, and something about that made him seem less distant, less like the man who had always existed behind a barrier of control. "So are you," she replied softly, her tone matching his. And for a moment, neither of them moved, not out of uncertainty, but because this moment mattered more than either of them was willing to rush. Ethan stepped forward first, but slower than she had ever seen him move, as if he was aware of every inch of space between them, aware of what it meant to close it now. And when he reached the table, he did not pull out the chair across from him. He pulled out the one beside his gesture simple, quiet, but unmistakable, an invitation rather than an expectation. Lily hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because she did not understand, but because she did. And accepting it meant stepping into something that no longer followed the rules she had learned to rely on. But then she moved, taking the seat he offered, her movements calm, controlled, but inside, something shifted again, something that felt a little like trust, or at least the beginning of it. The dinner itself was simple, not extravagant, not designed to impress, and that in itself felt different, because nothing about this was meant to perform, it was meant to connect. And as they began to eat, the silence that followed was not the same as before. It was not empty. It was waiting, and Lily realized that this time, it was not about avoiding conversation. It was about choosing where to begin. "Tell me something about you," Ethan said after a moment, his voice steady but softer than she had ever heard it in this space. And the request caught her off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it was something he had never asked before. Not in 3 years of living under the same roof. She looked at him carefully, searching for any sign that this was routine, that this was just another part of a controlled interaction. But there was none, only genuine attention, and for a moment, she did not know what to say, not because she had nothing to share, but because she had never been given the space to do so. "You already know everything important," she said lightly, almost deflecting out of habit, but Ethan shook his head slightly, his gaze steady. "No," he said quietly. "I know what was written on paper. I want to know what was never written." And that changed everything, because for the first time, He was not asking about facts, he was asking about her. And Lily felt something inside her shift once more, something that had been waiting, perhaps longer than she realized, for this exact moment to finally exist. For a moment, Lily did not answer, and the quiet between them stretched, not uncomfortable, but fragile, as if whatever she chose to say next would shape something far more important than a simple conversation. And she felt it in the way her fingers rested lightly against the edge of her plate, in the way her gaze lingered on Ethan just a second longer than usual before she finally looked down, gathering her thoughts in a way she had not needed to do in a very long time. "There is not much to tell," she said softly at first, the words almost automatic, the same kind of response she had given countless times when people asked about her life. A safe answer, a contained answer, one that revealed nothing she was not ready to share. But Ethan did not look away, did not accept that distance, and that alone made her pause. "That is not true," he said quietly, not correcting her, but inviting her to reconsider, and something about the way he said it, steady, patient, made it harder for her to retreat into silence the way she usually would. She let out a small breath, her shoulders relaxing just slightly as she realized that this was different, that he was not asking out of obligation, not filling space, but genuinely waiting. And for the first time, she felt the weight of being seen in a way that made hiding feel unnecessary. "I grew up in a small town in Ohio," she began slowly, her voice calm but more open now. "Nothing like this," her eyes briefly flickering around the room before returning to him. "We did not have much, but it was enough." And as she spoke, something subtle shifted in her expression, not dramatic, but real, like she was stepping into a memory she had not visited in a long time. Ethan listened without interrupting, his attention unwavering, not rushing her, not steering the conversation, and that alone gave her the space to continue in a way she had never experienced with him before. "My father worked 2 jobs, she added, a faint smile touching her lips. "He used to say that as long as we had dinner together, we were doing better than most." And for a second, that memory softened something in her, something that had been buried under years of practicality and quiet endurance. Ethan's gaze shifted slightly at that, not away from her, but deeper, as if he was absorbing every detail, every piece of her story that had never been written into any contract or document. "That sounds different," he said after a moment, his tone thoughtful, not dismissive, but curious in a way that felt genuine. And Lily nodded slightly, because it was different, completely different from the world he came from, the world they were sitting in now. "It was simple," she said, and there was something in that word, something that lingered longer than it should have, because simple was not something she had felt in a long time, not since stepping into this life, not since becoming part of something that had never quite felt like hers. The silence that followed was not empty. It was reflective, as if both of them were sitting with the contrast between what was and what had been. And for a moment, Lily wondered if he understood what she was not saying, the part about how far removed she had felt from everything around her for the past 3 years, how she had adapted without ever truly belonging. "Why did you agree to this marriage?" Ethan asked quietly, and the question was not abrupt, not intrusive, but it carried a weight that shifted the moment into something more personal, something that could not be answered lightly. Lily's fingers stilled slightly, her breath slowing as she looked at him again, really looked at him, because this was not a question she could answer with distance, not anymore. And for a brief second, she considered deflecting, keeping it simple, keeping it safe, but something about the way he was sitting there, open, attentive, made that feel unnecessary. "Because I needed stability," she said honestly, her voice steady but softer now. "And because I thought I could handle it." And there was no bitterness in her tone, just truth, because at the time, she had believed she could exist in a space defined by rules and distance without letting it affect her, believed she could remain untouched by something that was never meant to be real. Ethan absorbed that quietly, his expression unreadable for a moment, and then something shifted, not visibly, but in the way his gaze softened just slightly, as if he understood more than she expected. And sitting there beside him, not across from him, not separated by distance, Lily realized that this conversation, this simple exchange of truths, was already changing something between them, something that had been absent for far too long, something that felt, for the first time, like the beginning of something neither of them could pretend was just part of an agreement anymore. The conversation did not end when the plates were cleared. It lingered in the quiet that followed, in the way neither of them seemed in a hurry to leave the table, as if stepping away would break something that had only just begun to form. And Lily found herself noticing small details she had never paid attention to before. The way Ethan rested his hand loosely on the table instead of pulling it back immediately. The way his posture was no longer rigid, no longer guarded, but open in a way that felt unfamiliar and yet strangely reassuring. She glanced at him briefly, then away, then back again, as if confirming that this was real, that this was not just a moment that would disappear once the routine returned. And when their eyes met again, there was no awkwardness, no need to look away quickly like before, only a quiet understanding that neither of them quite had words for yet. "You said you thought you could handle it," Ethan said after a moment, his voice calm but thoughtful, picking up where she had left off earlier, and Lily nodded slightly. Because she had said that, and at the time, she had meant it, fully, believed it even. "I did," she replied, her tone honest, not defensive. "I thought if I kept things clear, if I did not expect anything, then it would be easy." And she let out a faint breath, a small, almost amused exhale at her own past certainty, because looking back now, it seemed almost naive. Ethan's gaze remained steady on her, not interrupting, not rushing her, and that gave her the space to continue in a way that felt natural instead of forced. But it is not easy to live next to someone every day and pretend it does not matter, she added quietly, and there was no accusation in her voice, just truth, the kind that did not need to be sharpened to be felt. Ethan's expression shifted again, subtle but clear, as if her words were settling into him piece by piece, reshaping something he had long taken for granted, and for a moment, he did not respond, not because he did not have anything to say, but because he was choosing his words more carefully than he ever had before. "I did not think you would feel that way," he admitted finally, his voice lower now, not distant, not detached, but reflective, and Lily looked at him, really looked at him, because that answer revealed something important, not about her, but about him. "That is the problem," she said gently, not harshly, but with clarity. "You did not think about how I would feel at all." And this time, the words were not meant to hurt. They were meant to be understood, and Ethan did not argue, did not deflect. He simply nodded once, acknowledging it in a way that felt more meaningful than any explanation could have been. The silence that followed was different again, not heavy, not uncomfortable, but honest, as if they were both sitting with the truth of what had been, without trying to reshape it into something easier to accept. Lily shifted slightly in her seat, her gaze drifting for just a second to the side before returning to him, and there was something softer in her expression now, not because the past had changed, but because the present was starting to. "It is not just about what you did not do," she continued, her voice quieter, more introspective. "It is about what I allowed myself to believe." And Ethan's brow furrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in attention, because this was something he had not expected. "I told myself it was enough," she said, her words measured, thoughtful, "that this was the deal, that I agreed to it, so I had no right to want more." And for the first time, there was a hint of vulnerability in her tone that she had not shown before, not because she was weak, but because she was choosing to be honest in a way she had not allowed herself to be. Ethan leaned back slightly, not withdrawing, but giving her space, listening in a way that felt intentional, and something in that made it easier for her to continue. "But wanting more does not make me wrong," she added, her voice steady again, grounded in something stronger than before. "It just makes me human." And that was it, the line that shifted everything, because it reframed the entire foundation of what they had been living in, not as a clean agreement, but as something that had always been incomplete. Ethan absorbed that in silence, his gaze steady on her, and for a moment, it was clear that he was seeing her differently, not as the woman who had quietly accepted the terms of their marriage, but as someone who had carried more than he had ever realized. And as the quiet of the room settled around them once more, it became clear that this conversation was no longer about the past. It was about whether they were ready to build something entirely different from it. The room felt quieter now, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had finally been brought to the surface. And as Lily's last words settled between them, Ethan remained still for a moment, his gaze fixed on her with a depth that had not been there before, not in 3 years of controlled distance and quiet detachment. And for the first time, it was clear that he was not just hearing her. He was understanding her. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely noticeable but enough to mark the shift inside him, as if something he had held onto for far too long had finally loosened its grip. And when he spoke, his voice carried none of the certainty he had once relied on, only something more grounded, more real. "You are right," he said again. But this time it meant more, because it was not just agreement, it was recognition of her, of what she had lived through beside him, of what he had failed to see. Lily watched him carefully, not expecting immediate change, not expecting everything to suddenly fall into place. But something in the way he stood there, no longer hiding behind control, made it impossible to dismiss this moment as temporary. And yet she did not move closer, did not close the distance for him, because that was not her role anymore, not if this was going to be different. Ethan seemed to understand that without her needing to say it, because instead of stepping forward, he shifted slightly, not away, but enough to show that he was no longer trying to take control of the space between them. And that alone spoke louder than anything else he could have done. "I thought I was giving you freedom," he continued, his tone quieter now, reflective in a way that felt unfamiliar even to himself. "I thought if I did not expect anything from you, then you would not feel trapped." And Lily's expression softened just slightly at that, not because it justified anything, but because it revealed something she had not considered before, not the action itself, but the intention behind it. "But you never asked me what I wanted," she replied gently, and this time, there was no edge in her voice, no need for it, because they had already moved past that point. Now it was about understanding, not blame. Ethan nodded once, slowly, as if committing that truth to memory, not just hearing it, but learning from it. And for a moment, the space between them felt balanced in a way it never had before, not defined by distance, but by choice. Lily shifted slightly in her seat, her posture more relaxed now, not because everything was resolved, but because something fundamental had changed, something that allowed her to exist in this space without feeling like she had to guard herself as closely as before. And as she looked at him again, she realized that this was the first time she was not trying to predict his next move, not trying to prepare for distance or silence, but simply present in the moment. "What do you want now?" she asked, the question simple but significant, because this was no longer about contracts or expectations. It was about intention, about what came next, and Ethan did not answer immediately, not out of hesitation, but because this time he was choosing his words with care, not for control, but for honesty. "I want to know you," he said finally, his voice steady, grounded in something that felt different from anything he had said before, not as part of an agreement, not as someone I live with, but as my wife. And that word, wife, carried a different weight now, not just a title, but something he was choosing to mean. Lily held his gaze, her breath steady, her expression thoughtful, because that answer was not grand, it was not overwhelming, but it was real, and for the first time, that felt like enough to consider, enough to take the next step forward without losing herself in the process. And as the quiet of the room settled around them once more, it became clear that this was no longer about what they had been. It was about what they were choosing to become, one moment at a time. The word stayed with her, not just in the moment, but in the quiet that followed. And as Lily sat there beside him, she realized that something subtle but undeniable had shifted, not just in him, but in herself, because for the first time in 3 years, she was no longer bracing for distance, no longer preparing for silence. She was simply listening, allowing the moment to exist without trying to protect herself from it. Her gaze lingered on him for a second longer than usual, studying the way he held himself now. Not rigid, not guarded, but open in a way that felt unfamiliar and yet steady. And it made her wonder how much of him had always been like this beneath the surface, hidden behind decisions he thought were right at the time. "You say that now," she said softly, not dismissing his words, but grounding them in reality, because wanting something in a moment and sustaining it over time were not the same, and she needed him to understand that. Ethan nodded slightly, not defensive, not trying to convince her otherwise, but accepting the weight of what she meant, because this was no longer about proving himself with words. It was about consistency, about showing up in ways he had never considered before. "I know," he replied, his voice calm but certain, "and I know it is not enough to say it once." And there was something in that acknowledgement that felt different, something that suggested he was not looking for immediate trust, but willing to earn it piece by piece. Lily let out a small breath, her shoulders relaxing just slightly as she took that in, because this was the first time he was not trying to resolve everything at once, not trying to control the outcome, but allowing it to unfold naturally. And that alone made it easier for her to stay present, to not retreat into the familiar distance she had relied on for so long. She glanced down briefly, her eyes catching the reflection of the light against the surface of her ring, the one she had worn every day without ever feeling its meaning. And for a moment, she turned it slightly with her fingers, a small, absent motion that carried more weight than it seemed. "Do you remember the day we signed the contract?" she asked, quietly, her voice thoughtful, and Ethan's gaze followed hers for just a second before returning to her face. And he nodded, because that day was not something either of them could forget, even if they had never spoken about it again. "You told me everything would be clear," she continued, her tone calm but reflective. "No confusion, no expectations, no complications." And there was a faint pause after that, not because she was unsure, but because she was choosing her next words carefully. Ethan remained still, listening, not interrupting, and that gave her the space to continue without hesitation. "And I believed you," she said, and this time, there was something softer in her voice, not regret, but recognition, because at the time, that clarity had felt like safety, like something she could rely on. "But clarity does not mean connection," she added, her gaze lifting back to his, steady and honest. And the weight of that statement settled between them, not as a criticism, but as a truth that could no longer be ignored. Ethan exhaled slowly, his expression shifting in a way that showed he understood exactly what she meant, because he had built everything around clarity, structure, control, and yet none of it had created something real between them. "Then we start without that," he said quietly, not as a rejection of what they had agreed to, but as a choice to move beyond it. "No rules this time." And Lily's eyes searched his face again, not questioning his intention, but measuring what that actually meant, because without rules, there was uncertainty, and uncertainty required trust, something they were only beginning to build. "No rules does not mean no boundaries," she replied gently, and Ethan nodded again, immediately, because this time, he was not trying to define things on his own. He was listening, adjusting, learning in a way that felt entirely new. "Then you tell me where they are," he said, his voice steady, leaving the space open for her. And for the first time, Lily felt something she had not allowed herself to feel before in this marriage. Not obligation, not resignation, but choice, the ability to shape what came next instead of simply accepting it. And as she looked at him, really looked at him, she realized that whatever this was becoming, it was no longer something decided for her. It was something she could step into willingly, one moment at a time. The moment lingered, quiet but full, as Lily's last words settled into the space between them. And for a second, neither of them moved, not because there was nothing left to say, but because what came next mattered more than anything that had already been spoken. And Lily could feel it in the way her heartbeat had slowed but not steadied, in the way her thoughts no longer rushed but instead focused on a single, undeniable truth. This was the point where everything either changed or returned to what it had always been. She lifted her gaze to meet Ethan's, holding it there, steady, intentional, no longer avoiding the weight of what stood between them. Because if she was going to step into this, even carefully, even slowly, then she needed to be clear, not just with him, but with herself. "If we are doing this," she said, her voice calm but firm, "then we do it honestly." And there was no hesitation in her tone, no softness to soften the meaning, because honesty was not optional anymore. It was the foundation of whatever this could become. Ethan nodded immediately, not questioning, not interrupting, because this time, he understood that this was not something he could shape on his own. It was something they had to build together. No disappearing into silence when things get difficult. she continued, her words measured but certain. No deciding for both of us what something means without asking. And each condition was not a demand, but a boundary, something she had learned. The importance of through experience, through years of adapting without being asked what she needed. Ethan's gaze did not waver, and when he spoke, his voice was steady, grounded in something that felt more real than anything he had said before. I will not do that again. And there was no hesitation in his response, no attempt to negotiate, only agreement, because for the first time, he was not trying to maintain control. He was choosing to give it up where it mattered. Lily studied him. For a moment longer, not searching for doubt, but allowing herself to believe, even if only a little, because trust did not come all at once. It came in moments like this, in small decisions to move forward instead of stepping back. She nodded slightly, a quiet acknowledgement that she heard him, that she was willing to continue, and something in the room shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to be felt, as if the distance that had defined them for so long had finally lost its place. Between them, Ethan took a breath, his posture relaxing just slightly, and for a moment, he seemed to consider his next move, not with the calculated precision she was used to, but with a kind of awareness that made it clear he understood the significance of even the smallest action now. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out, not abruptly, not crossing the line without thought, but pausing just short of her hand, giving her the space to choose, to accept, or to step back, and that pause meant more than the gesture itself, because it showed that he was no longer assuming, no longer taking, but offering. Lily's gaze dropped briefly to his hand, then back to his face, and for a second, the past flickered through her mind. Every moment he had stepped away, every time she had stood just out of reach, and then it faded, replaced by the present, by the quiet steadiness of this moment, by the fact that this time, he was not pulling back, but waiting. Her fingers moved before she fully realized it, a small, deliberate motion as she placed her hand in his, not gripping tightly, not rushing into something overwhelming, but resting there, light but certain, and the contact was simple, almost understated, but it carried a weight that neither of them could ignore, because it was the first time in 3 years that the distance between them had been closed by choice, not by accident, not by necessity, but by something real. Ethan's hand remained steady beneath hers, not tightening, not holding on too strongly, as if he understood that this was not about possession, it was about connection, and Lily felt it. The difference, subtle but undeniable, the shift from something controlled to something mutual. And as they sat there, side by side, their hands lightly joined, it became clear that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something neither of them could define yet, but both were finally willing to try. The warmth of his hand did not fade quickly. It lingered, quiet and steady, and Lily realized that what made it different was not the touch itself, but the intention behind it, the absence of control, the presence of choice. And as she sat there beside him, she did not feel like she was stepping into something uncertain anymore. She felt like she was stepping into something that was finally being built with her, not around her. Her fingers remained in his, not tightening, not pulling away, simply existing in that shared space. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because this silence felt complete, not empty, not waiting, but settled in a way that neither of them had experienced together before. Ethan's gaze rested on her quietly, not searching, not analyzing, but present. And there was something in that presence that made Lily's chest ease in a way she had not expected, because for 3 years, she had learned to exist beside him without truly being seen. And now, in the simplest of moments, that had changed. She let out a soft breath, her eyes drifting briefly toward the city beyond the glass, the lights stretching endlessly into the distance. And for the first time since she had moved into this place, it did not feel like something she was looking at from the outside. It felt like something she was standing within. "This still feels new," she said quietly, her voice calm but honest, not questioning it, not resisting it, just acknowledging it for what it was. And Ethan nodded slightly, because he felt it too, the unfamiliar steadiness of something that had never been allowed to exist before. "It is," he replied, his tone just as quiet. "But that does not make it uncertain." And Lily turned back to him at that, studying his expression, because those words carried a kind of confidence she had not expected. Not the kind that came from control, but the kind that came from clarity, and she found herself believing him, not completely, not without caution, but enough to stay, enough to continue. Her hand shifted slightly in his, not pulling away, but adjusting, settling more naturally into the contact. And that small movement spoke more than any words could have, because it was not forced, it was not deliberate, it was instinctive, and Ethan felt it. The difference, the quiet acceptance that came with it. "We should not rush this," she added after a moment, her voice thoughtful. Because even as something new was forming, she understood the importance of letting it grow at its own pace, of not turning this into something fragile by trying to define it too quickly. Ethan nodded again, immediately, because this time, he was not leading, he was aligning. "We will not," he said, and there was no hesitation in that promise, no need to prove it, because the way he had approached this entire moment had already shown it. Lily allowed herself a small, almost unnoticeable smile. Not because everything was resolved, but because for the first time, she felt like it could be, not through control, not through agreements, but through something much simpler and much more difficult at the same time: honesty, presence, and the willingness to stay even when things were uncertain. She gently withdrew her hand after a moment, not abruptly, not as a rejection, but as a natural end to something that had already fulfilled its purpose, and Ethan did not try to hold on, did not reach to stop her, because he understood that this was not something to be taken. It was something to be given, freely, again and again. They both stood a few seconds later, not in a hurry, not breaking the moment, but carrying it forward with them. And as Lily turned slightly toward the hallway that led to her room, she paused, just for a second, before looking back at him. And in that glance, there was something different, something lighter, something that had not been there before. "Good night, Ethan," she said softly, and the way she said his name held a warmth that had never existed between them until now. "Good night, Lily," he replied, just as quietly, and as she walked away, the space she left behind did not feel empty. It felt full, filled with something that had finally taken shape after years of distance, something that did not need to be named yet to be real. And standing there alone in the quiet of the room, Ethan understood with a clarity he had never allowed himself before that what they had started tonight was not just a change in their marriage. It was the first honest beginning they had ever had, and this time, he was not going to step back.